Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be in this circle, and it's also a pleasure to me to show a place which is very close to my heart, because that's where I was born. We are still staying in Central Europe. We have just been to Prague and to Nuremberg, and now we are moving slightly to the southeast, and we turn to the bend of the greatest river of Europe, namely the Danube, which will play a very prominent role in the story. And you can imagine that a place where this river turns in a right angle was destined almost by default to be an important political center. In the Roman times, as many of you know, this was the line of the limes, the border between the Barbaricum and the Roman imperial space. And during the Hungarian kingdom, it rather became the center of the kingdom. It was even named as Medium Regni in the contemporary sources. Interestingly enough, for ecclesiastical terms, the site of the later Buda, Pest, and Óbuda, which we are going to talk about, was on the margin. It was in a liminal space between the Archbishopric of Veszprém and Vác, close also to the Archbishopric of Esztergom, but there was no evident church hierarchy which gave more liberty to shaping urban space through other types of ecclesiastical institutions. We can pose the question, which we heard from Elisa yesterday when speaking about cospatiality, referring to the Chicago School, many cities in one city, many cities or one city, so leading us to cospatiality, which was the pretext which I used for proposing this paper here. But equally, we can use many of the other notions which we heard about yesterday through the glossary, when we try to explain and understand the shaping of urbanity through these ecclesiastic institutions. If you think about modern Budapest, this is just a small fraction of its territory. It extends much larger, and you can imagine the development which took place in the later periods. But let's go back to the origins. The oldest of all these parts or cities in one city is called Óbuda, or originally only Buda. The name means old Buda now. And we can see already here the idea how space, already important strategically in Roman times, was transformed in the medieval period. You can see that it was a legionary camp, one of the 4 legions in the territory of Roman Pannonia. And in the 4th, 5th century, another outside fortification was constructed very close to the port of the Danube, and it was by this space that the collegiate chapter dedicated to Peter and Paul was founded by one of the 11th century kings. You can see the reconstruction, which shows a magnificent building, bigger than most cathedrals of the period in Hungary. And you can also imagine that it needed important endowments in order to sustain it. And these endowments followed the course of the Danube. They were royal revenues given to the chapter by subsequent kings in the 11th and 12th century, namely revenues from fishing down about 6 to 8 kilometers to the south, so very long area, plus revenues from salt trade and also the market taxes. So it meant that by this kind of donation, the chapter became a very important urban player through the revenues which it gained. Later on, it was transformed into a Gothic building, just to show it for Zoe's sake, and also because architectural historians claim that its portal is a kind of relative of the Erfurt Cathedral Western Portal. So there are connections even in unexpected ways. Óbuda lost its importance when its successor, the later Buda, became more prominent. We will get to that in a minute. But we can also point out that the chapter became the owner of the northern part, and later on the queen, also later founder of several ecclesiastic institutions, got into the possession of the southern part of this settlement. The next in time was the town of Pest, so the left bank of the Danube. And here you see a similar pattern. Also in Óbuda, I didn't mention, but there was also a royal house beside the chapter. So it was the secular and the ecclesiastic power. In that case, the ecclesiastic power became more important. In case of Pest, it was the royal house on the site, again, of the harbor by the Danube, and also a place which was a convergence of various routes coming from the eastern part of the country towards the center, and an ensemble of a marketplace, a harbor, and a dwelling place of ferrymen was developed here. And the church, which was originally a chapel connected to the royal house, became the parish church. So there was a transformation in the function, but it was the same place which attracted this function. And perhaps surprisingly for many of you, Pest in the 11th, 12th century also had a very important Muslim community, traders who were involved in salt trade and involved in collecting royal revenues, to the extent that their cemetery, which was separate from the one which took place beside the parish church, this cemetery was known as the cemetery of the heathens, even a couple of hundred years after the presence of the Muslim community in Pest. In the 13th century, this was one of the earliest places where a mendicant friary was established, namely the Dominicans in the 1220s, which became also a refuge at the time of the Mongol invasion, which devastated the already existing settlement complexes along the Danube. So this was the time when the third and later most significant settlement part was founded. That was a kind of a forced specialization. The king had to look for a place which was better protected, more defendable than the previous ones down on the flatland, and this became Buda, the new Buda, in a way, also called the New Castle of Pest, because some rights were taken over. Interesting features are, again, an early royal house, which was called the Kammerhof. You can also see it here encircled in green. And this house was complemented by, again, a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, which later, again, in a few decades, turned into parish church from a former private royal chapel. And again, very early, together with the foundation, there was a Dominican friary, which could not be sustained first just by the people, but was dependent very much on royal generosity and royal benefices. Even more interestingly, the rights of patronage of the church, which became the parish church, was given to a monastic institution, the Dominican nunnery on the Margaret Island, or in my paper I term it, which was closer to the medieval name, the Island of Hares. So you can imagine the wildlife there. So this Dominican nunnery, which you will see in a second, was the patron of a church which later became a parish church of an urban community, which theoretically, through its privileges, had the right to elect their own parish priest. So there was a great fight and entanglement. On top of that, the Bishop of Veszprém claimed his right, and the Archbishop of Esztergom also claimed his right, because if it was originally a royal church, then he had the right over it. So we can see in the sources how these different actors try to claim ownership over the same space and the same rights. And going to the nunnery, you can see the place which gave the location for no less than 5 different monastic institutions. This island on the Danube is nowadays a pleasure spot for lovers and visitors to the city. But at that time, it was due to its liminal existence between originally Óbuda and Pest, later also Buda. You can see the 3 related to each other. This space on the island housing these monasteries, most importantly the Dominican nunnery, became a kind of sacred liminal space between the 2 banks of the Danube. And the most important inhabitant of this nunnery was the daughter of King Béla IV in the mid-13th century, Margaret, after which later the island was named. She died in the fame of sanctity, even if she was not canonized for another 700 years. But there were miracles happening by her grave. There were people healed both in her lifetime and afterwards. And this radiated not only to both banks of the Danube, but we have canonization trials, lists of people coming to Margaret's grave from all over the country. So this extended the space inhabited by the nuns in its sanctity to the entire country. Similarly, very important sacred space was the Gellért Hill. You may have, if you have been to Budapest, you cannot help noticing it, which was the place of the martyrdom of a bishop of Csanád called Gellért or Gerard, who died in the 11th century in a pagan uprising, which was a backlash of the quick Christianizing project in the 11th century. And his body was buried at the church of Pest, which I have shown you a couple of slides ago. So that shows the 11th century importance of the connection between the two sides of the Danube. And also the legend that the blood of his martyrdom was not washed away from the rocks by the Danube for 7 years, also testifies his sanctity and the lasting impression of the martyr bishop. This was another site outside the core areas of the urban territories, and the third one was also an important pilgrimage site. The Pauline friars, originally an eremitic order founded by Hungarians, acquired the body of Saint Paul the Hermit, who was an Egyptian late antique hermit saint, and the site of pilgrimage also outside the core areas of the urban environment. Again, extended, there were processions, there were pilgrimages and direct connection, and this happened already in the 13th century, and in the 15th century, two other suburban or peri-urban monasteries were given over to the Paulines, which gave a kind of sacred belt in this area, in this perimeter around the city of Buda. A couple of words about the processes taking place in the later Middle Ages. So these were the foundational ecclesiastic institutions marking out the space. We can see processes of segregation. The Jewish community which resided in the southern tip of Buda was moved by King Sigismund to the northern part at the same time when he built his palace and his court. So this reflects on the functions of the court city, and King didn't want to have the Jewish street on the way, the entrance to his own palace. At the same time, the parish boundaries got modified, and there was an increasing process of ethnic segregation between the German parish, the original Our Lady's parish, and the parish of the Hungarians. There was a multiplication of monastic institutions. Just to stay with the mendicants, there were in all quarters of the agglomeration, there was a Franciscan friary founded, and there were also 3 Dominican friaries, 3 Paulines. So you can see that this multiplication of the agglomeration also was mirrored in the great number of the monastic institutions. And just to take the story towards Nora's interest and the period we have heard about from her, you can see how the ecclesiastic institutional setup changed in the Ottoman period. Buda became part of the Ottoman Empire for almost 150 years in 1541, and you can see how all these monasteries, chapels, and chapters marked in red became, except for a single institution, parts of Muslim worship in the 16th and 17th centuries. So to sum up, what kind of cospatiality can we observe when we look at this institutional development, which I had to compress very much? We can see the sharing of the same physical space, of course, by the institutions, and by sharing the space, I also mean visibility from various vantage points together, accessibility. Within one day, you could basically visit all these institutions one by one, and Also, you could see, I didn't have time to go into it, altars of various communities within the same ecclesiastic building, sharing the same economic space, taking revenues from the Danube, which was prominent for the first institution I mentioned, but also characterized many of the others, was very important, and also, and that you can see in many late medieval cities, benefiting from the economy of salvation. The more institutions you donate, the more days you collect for being remitted from purgatory, meaning that the multiplicity of the institutions was less competitive, but rather additional to each other. And finally, as we could see with the examples of the Margaret Island and the Gellert Hill, sharing the same spiritual space with saints and miracles, connected with processions, and also shared by the living and the dead in form of cemeteries, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian in various parts, in various times, was very important for cospatiality. And I would like to argue, and maybe we can take it up in the discussion, that the Danube was the switch. We heard from Elisa that we need a switch, and I think in this case the Danube was this crucial element. And this is my very last moment. How typical or how special it is, how good it is to know about such examples like Buda for comparative research. I think it is a very good example for riverine agglomerations. Prague was another one which we heard from Zoe. Late medieval Latin Christianity had a multiplicity of similar cities in East Central Europe or in court cities, as we heard about one of the morning papers. What is a little bit specific, at least compared to other cities of Central Europe, is the ethnic division or overlap between Germans, Hungarians, also Italians and Jews were present, and also these important and immense changes almost overnight after the Ottoman occupation, which we can also perhaps discuss later. Thank you very much for your attention.